Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel kicks the empty air at the end of a rope. His face turns dark purple. He fights for a single breath. 28 minutes of violent convulsions on the Nuremberg gallows. The drop fails to snap his neck. The man who priced human lives in exact blood quotas dies a slow, ugly death. The rope pulls tight because of a single piece of paper he signed back in Berlin. September 16, 1941. Keitel issues a direct math problem to the Wehrmacht troops stationed in occupied Serbia. 1 dead German soldier equals 100 dead Serbian civilians. 1 wounded German equals 50 dead civilians. The local commanders simply do the math. General Franz Böhme needs bodies to hit his mandated quotas. 10 Germans die in a 90-minute firefight near the town of Gornji Milanovac. The ledger immediately demands 2,300 lives. The troops wipe out the surrounding villages. They quickly run out of people to shoot, so the officers look straight toward Kragujevac. Before the invasion, Kragujevac held about 30,000 residents. It was a normal Serbian town. Now the German command targets its civilian corps to fill the spreadsheet. The 717th Infantry Division rolls into the narrow streets. They don't look for armed partisans, they just look for numbers. 12-year-old boys sit quietly at their wooden desks. Outside, heavy machine guns wait on steel tripods. Kids holding notebooks against a fully equipped German infantry division. Soldiers kick the school doors open. They grab the kids by their collars. They drag them out of the classrooms and push them into lines. The teachers refuse to stay behind. They walk out into the cold courtyard and stand right next to their students. The firing squads rack their bolts. The heavy machine guns open up. The deafening roar of 7.92mm rounds completely drowns out every scream in the schoolyard. The shooting doesn't stop. The gunners reload the ammunition belts and keep firing until the lines fall. In exactly 7 hours, the Wehrmacht wipes out nearly a tenth of the entire city. 2,700 bodies cover the dirt of the schoolyard. To understand how Serbia reached the point of executing school children, the calendar has to roll back 5 months. 600 German bombers cast shadows over the residential blocks of Belgrade. It is the morning of April 6, 1941. The roar of hundreds of aviation engines drowns out the early sky. Hitler launches a punitive strike without a single formal declaration of war. The targets are not military bases or defensive forts. The payload drops directly onto densely populated civilian streets. Apartment blocks collapse into concrete dust. Balconies tear away from facades. 4,000 civilians die crushed under the rubble in the very first hours of the assault. Firestorms sweep through the capital. For a clear historical scale, the bombing of Granica involved just around 40 aircraft. Belgrade faces 15 times that number in one single morning. While the capital burns, the borders collapse. Axis forces cross into the Kingdom of Yugoslavia from multiple directions. Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria push their armored columns forward. The Yugoslav government manages to mobilize over 1 million soldiers for defense. But the real collapse comes from within the ranks. Deep ethnic divisions tear the defensive lines apart before the fighting even peaks. Croatian and Macedonian units refuse to fight for a Serbian-dominated command. Mutinies spread across the barracks. Entire regiments abandon their posts instead of shooting at the invading forces. Soldiers drop their rifles and simply walk home. Some political factions actively welcome the foreign troops into their towns. The military fractures entirely from the inside, leaving loyalist forces isolated on the battlefield. 11 days later, the combat stops. The country finds itself surrounded and broken. On April 17, 1941, the Yugoslav High Command accepts the inevitable reality. Representatives sit down in a ruined building. They sign the document of unconditional surrender. The defeat on April 17th did not bring quiet to the occupied territory. Deep in the woods, a man named Josip Broz Tito started pulling together a disciplined communist underground called the Partisans. Royalist fighters known as Chetniks also took up arms to fight the new authorities. The Dinarec Alps covered most of the region, making it practically impossible for the Germans to use heavy armor against them. Instead of open battles, these resistance groups relied on sudden ambushes to cripple the enemy. Blown-up supply trains and ruined bridges quickly became a daily reality for the nervous occupying forces. Local garrison soldiers lived in constant anxiety, knowing any routine patrol might easily be their last. As guerrilla warfare spread across the mountains, the German army found itself with exactly 0 safe roads. With 0 safe roads left, Berlin found a bureaucratic solution to the ambushes. The death of one occupying soldier was officially paid for by the lives of 100 locals. On September 16, 1941, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed a new directive as Chief of the High Command. Keitel sat at his Berlin desk. The dry rustle of official paper echoed across the room. He pressed the ink stamp onto the final page. The document established a strict execution formula. 1 dead German equaled 100 executed civilians. 1 wounded German meant 50 dead locals. In occupied France, the standard retaliation ratio rarely exceeded 50-1. Serbia received exactly double the quota. The directive specifically targeted suspected communists, local nationalists, and Jewish residents. This was not a spontaneous battlefield reaction from frustrated troops. The German command turned mass murder into a calculated administrative process. Local garrisons did not need to feel angry to pull the trigger. They just needed to follow the math and fill the graves. Blood became official currency. 3 days later, on September 19, 1941, the Berlin Quota Order found its perfect executor. Austrian General Franz Böhme took command in Serbia. He immediately remembered his fallen empire. Böhme turned the official directive into a personal vendetta. The Austro-Hungarian army lost over 400,000 men in the Serbian campaign of World War I. He kept this grudge alive for 27 years. Now he finally had the power to settle old scores. He stood before his troops and issued clear instructions. The general reminded them of the Austrian blood that soaked this exact dirt in 1914. They needed to avenge those past defeats. The soldiers of the 717th Division were just waiting for a reason to apply the quota. The mathematics of Franz Böhme turned into real numbers on the morning of October 21, 1941, right on the outskirts of Kragujevac. Soldiers of the 717th Infantry Division marched the captives straight into the open fields. They divided the men and boys into batches of 50 to 120 people. Heavy machine guns already waited in the tall grass. Gunners checked their ammunition belts and took their positions behind the sights. The executions started in the early light and continued for 7 straight hours. Machine gunners killed between 2,778 and 2,794 people in 7 hours. That meant the soldiers were shooting an average of nearly 400 people per hour. The calculation worked out to about 7 lives erased every single minute. An old teacher stood tall in the middle of the field alongside his young students. Instead of begging, the hostages linked their arms together and started singing. The words of the anthem, "Hey Slavs," rose from the crowd, piercing through the constant rattle of the gunfire. Bodies piled up on the suburban soil as the morning turned into afternoon. The dead included 144 high school boys, and 15 of those murdered kids were only 12 years old. When the weapons finally ran out of ammunition, the German officers stepped in to organize the aftermath. They handed shovels to the 200 men who survived the initial selection. The soldiers forced these prisoners to bury their own relatives in mass graves. 300 students and teachers. Those teenagers burying the dead in the field came straight from their morning classes. On October 20, 1941, armed soldiers kicked open the school doors. Chalk dust still sat on the blackboards. Troops walked down the narrow aisles and pulled boys directly from their desks. Some teachers tried to stand up and block the exits. Rifle butts pushed them hard into the crowded hallways. The dragnet moved quickly onto the busy streets outside. Roma children still held small wooden shoeshine brushes in their hands. They stood quietly among the large groups of captured adult men. The soldiers took these kids simply because they refused to clean German leather boots earlier that day. Kragujevac held about 40,000 residents at the time. The military command issued a strict order to seize all males between 16 and 60 years old. Truck convoys blocked off the local factories. Infantry squads shut down the central marketplaces. Within a few hours, the occupying force grabbed almost 1 in every 10 men living in the city. A normal morning transformed an entire civilian population into a reserve of disposable hostages. The filtering process started shortly after the main roundup. The local fascist organization known as Zbor arrived to inspect the temporary holding areas. They walked through the crowds to identify their own supporters. These local collaborators checked faces, verified names, and released 3,000 people. The German army hunted specific political targets, yet they ended up shooting ordinary residents of 4 farming villages. Soldiers grabbed those students and random bystanders from the previous day only because the initial targeted raid failed. Commanders expected to easily round up hundreds of suspects. Instead, on October 18, 1941, the city sweep yielded just 70 arrested Jews and communists. 70 men made up barely 3% of the demanded execution quota of 2,300 lives. The targeted political group ran out almost instantly. So on October 19th, troops moved out of the city and into neighboring rural areas. They entered Kragujevac, Massacre, Groznitsa, and Mladovac. Patrols simply pulled local farmers right from their homes. 422 dead civilians. Those 422 villagers were just a tiny fraction of a massive debt calculated by men at desks. Right after the fighting stopped, German officers did not send patrols into the woods to chase the partisans. Instead, they sat down at their tables with fountain pens and clean, unmarked sheets of paper. They opened the local registry books and began to run the numbers according to a very specific set of rules. A month earlier, on September 16th, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel had signed a directive designed specifically to crush any resistance across occupied territories. His order established a strict legal formula for dealing with military losses, removing all emotion from the retaliation process. The men in the room simply applied this new administrative standard to the casualties they had just suffered on the ground. The mechanics of this policy were straightforward and required only basic multiplication. The casualty report from the field showed exactly 10 German soldiers killed in action, and another 26 wounded during the 90-minute ambush. According to Keitel's official 100-to-1 and 50-to-1 decree, every dead German soldier required the execution of 100 local captives from the civilian population. Every wounded soldier carried a price tag of exactly 50 lives. The officers working at the desks multiplied the 10 dead men by 100, producing an initial total of 1,000 hostages. The math was simple. Then they took the 26 wounded men and multiplied them by 50, which added another 1,300 lives to the ledger. They drew a thick line at the bottom of the crisp white page and carefully wrote down the final sum. Exactly 2,300 people had to die to balance the books for a firefight they never saw. General Franz Bohm, the highest-ranking officer in Serbia, reviewed the handwritten quota and approved the calculation without hesitation. He viewed this not as revenge, but as a standard transaction intended to pacify the region. The completed paperwork was stamped and handed down to the commanders of the 717th Infantry Division for immediate execution. The math of 2,300 dead bodies came from one specific firefight. Guerrillas smashed through the outer guard posts. German soldiers scrambled backward under heavy fire, desperately looking for any solid cover. It was late September 1941. The town of Gornji Milanovac sat under a total siege. Resistance forces cut the main roads and blocked the rail lines. The German garrison found itself completely cut off. On September 29th, a joint force hit the town center. Chetniks and partisans attacked together. The primary target was the main German garrison. The soldiers took heavy machine gun fire from all directions. To survive the barrage, the troops barricaded themselves inside the local school building. They turned the empty classrooms into makeshift bunkers. Gornji Milanovac sits about 40 kilometers from Kragujevac. This exact distance defined the kill zone for the upcoming punitive operation. But right now, the Germans just tried to stay alive. The battle inside the town center raged for 90 minutes. Both sides traded heavy fire through the shattered school windows. No one backed down. The fighting stayed close and loud. After an hour and a half, the partisans finally withdrew. They left the German army with dead and wounded soldiers. The casualties from that partisan ambush eventually put a rope around the neck of the man who ordered the retaliation. The scaffold trap door swung open, and the falling body slammed directly against the wooden frame. A dull thud echoed as Wilhelm Keitel struck the edges of the drop zone. The field marshal who signed the 100-for-1 decree was now slowly strangling in Nuremberg. The execution took place on October 16, 1946. The builders made the gallows trapdoor too narrow for a man of his large physical build. The restricted fall prevented the thick noose from snapping his neck properly. Executioner John Woods hanged 9 other high-ranking Reich officials that same day, including Ribbentrop and Jodl. He miscalculated the required dimensions, leaving the architect of the mass shootings to just hang and choke. Keitel dangled inside the tight wooden box while blood flowed continuously from his fresh facial injuries. He convulsed and struggled for breath instead of dying instantly like the civilians he once condemned. The physical suffocation process dragged on without interruption. 28 minutes. Keitel faced the hangman's noose, but his field subordinate took a different exit. General Franz Bohm made his final decision inside a cramped, solitary cell. He once commanded massive armies in the Balkans with cold arrogance. Now he faced a quiet suicide behind locked steel doors. British troops captured him in Norway back in May 1945. They eventually transferred him to the Nuremberg prison complex to answer for the massacres. Bohm knew the score. He refused to sit in the dock and wait for a verdict from the judges. The former commander found a fast way out. He reached the 4th floor of the main detention building. He did not hesitate. The former general climbed over the railing and threw himself straight down into the void. No public trial happened. The executioner lost a client. Bohm hit the pavement and died without a single word of remorse. Franz Bohm escaped the gallows. But for the 717th Infantry Division, there was no Nuremberg. The Balkan forests awaited them instead. In 1941, these men stood in cordons and shot civilians. By May 1945, they desperately tried to surrender to the British Army in Austria. The German command reorganized them into the 117th Jaeger Division. They threw the unit into the worst fronts across Yugoslavia. The troops who executed schoolchildren found themselves trapped. They marched through thick, ancient Balkan forests. The dense canopy blocked the sun, and the air smelled of rotting pine. Hundreds of soldiers perished in isolated skirmishes. They died in anonymity, leaving their bones in the mountains of Bosnia. Meanwhile, local Serbian fascist Zabor forces tried a different route. These collaborators fled toward Austria to seek Western protection. The British Army intercepted them, but London had agreed to repatriate prisoners to Tito. British soldiers disarmed the militiamen and loaded them into closed railway cars. The trains rolled straight back into Yugoslavia. This handover operation affected tens of thousands of collaborators. There were no official tribunals at the end of the line. The partisans marched the returnees to open trenches. Firing squads shot them for high treason without a single chance for legal defense. The shallow graves of executed collaborators raise a fundamental question about the perpetrators. How does an ordinary infantryman become an executioner? Through the complete abandonment of personal responsibility. The massacre in Kragujevac in October 1941 was a tragedy of strict submission. High-ranking officers in Berlin did not pull the triggers themselves. Regular German soldiers carried out the orders on the ground, prioritizing military directives over human lives. They simply followed the required quota, rounding up random civilians across the city blocks. When a man surrenders his conscience to the military chain of command, shooting unarmed people becomes just another daily task. The Wehrmacht troops stood on one side of the muddy execution grounds. On the other side stood the citizens of Kragujevac, collected to meet the exact math of a military reprisal. Among the condemned was a local schoolmaster. He stood directly beside the young boys from his own classroom as the firing squad raised their rifles. He received the clear offer to step out of the line and walk away alive. The teacher stayed with his students. That surrender of personal responsibility became the core lesson Kragujevac left behind. Today, 352 hectares of Kragujevac soil form a memorial park. It is not just a tribute to the dead. Studying history here serves a practical purpose. It builds a factual immunity of conscience for the living. A society does not survive through weapons, but through independent thinking. That capacity remains the only real defense against hateful ideologies. People must recognize when radical ideas disguise themselves as routine orders. There are no excuses for blind obedience. The executioners eventually face their consequences, but legal justice arrives far too late. 28 minutes of Keitel suffocating at Nuremberg did not bring back a single one of those lives.